No. Good afternoon and welcome all the participants and guests who are present for today's online 7th virtual lecture of Science and Our Life series introduced by Indian Women Scientists Association during the pandemic times. We are located at Vashi, Navi Mumbai. Myself, Rita Mukhopadhyay, is your today's program coordinator, and I have a gentle request that guests do please use our chat box to introduce yourself, putting your comments, putting the questions you want to put to the speaker, all in the chat box, which our today's speaker, Padma Shri Rohini Godbole, will address at the end of her concluding remarks. Already in the 8th month of our pandemic lives, we have learned a few new etiquettes of online meetings. And for that, I request all of you to please look at the sign of microphone and the video camera and turn them off so that the meeting can go on without any other technical wavelengths of disturbances. Also, there is a present now icon towards the right end of our computer monitors or mobiles. Kindly stay as far as you can from that so that while Dr. Godbole is presenting her talk, none of us will enter the same, you would call it the web room, so that there is no technical snag. With this, I would like to request Dr. Devaki Ramanathan, present convener of Science Awareness Committee of Indian Women Scientists Association, our past president during the time 2015 to 17, to give her introductory remark for today's series of lectures. Dr. Devaki has been a physicist by profession, worked for the Bhabha Atomic Research Center, and post the time she has been dedicating her education and inspiration to IFSA. Dr. Devaki, please.
Thank you, Rita. I'm audible? Okay.
Yes.
Hello. Good evening to everyone. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome Padma Shri Professor Rohini Godbole, the speaker of today's talk, in our Science and Our Life webinar series. This series is a monthly program introduced by the Indian Women Scientists Association during the pandemic days. These webinars are open not only to IFSA members, IFSA is the acronym, but also to the interested public, to whosoever is interested in augmenting his or her knowledge. I think most of our audience is aware of our NGO, the IFSA, whose headquarters is located at Vashi. The rolling slides that were shown here depict our objectives of taking science to the masses, developing a scientific temper in the society, and empowering women. We have a membership of 2,500 women with 12 branches across the country, started in 1973 by 12 founder members, all reputed women scientists. We are today a fairly strong NGO carrying out these mandates set up by our founder members. More details are available on our website, www.ifsa.net. Now, before the pandemic, our campus at Sector 10 Vashi typically is always buzzing with various activities and programs. Unfortunately, under the conditions of the pandemic, we have to adopt to the new normal and webinars have come very handy for us to meet and improve our scientific instincts. These lectures are aimed to discuss the state of understanding of the science around us, science in our everyday life, science within us, science of all issues governing, limiting, and developing our own existence. Whether we are lost in the cosmos or exist in our lonely planet, whether it is the rise of life or the richness of being, whether it is the Einstein's universe or the small world of bacteria or the elementary particles in the super colliders, there is still mystery shrouding all these paradox boxes, Pandora's boxes. The scientific inquisitive mind has been observing, studying, experimenting, and analyzing all these subjects. But as you unlock one box, there is another locked box inside, and another inside that, and so on. So, scientific inquisition and research becomes a continuous process, like the hermit search for finding the creator. In all these scientific pursuits, there is so much yet to be done, to be understood. All these matters are so intimately linked with our own life to give a meaningful understanding of our own existence and evolution. We wish to bring you through these webinars experts who could speak to you on their specialty subjects and unlock a few of the Pandora's boxes of knowledge. We have already had 6 webinars on a variety of subjects. This series was inaugurated on the 20th July 2020 by Dr. Nigamaja Hariharan, a physiotherapist. She discussed healthy habits for bladder and bowels, very intimately linked to our body, but a taboo subject for general discussion. The second talk was by Dr. G.P. Kotial, a retired scientist from BARC, who narrated the story of glass and glass ceramics, which has wide applications in every item of use in our life. Dr. Meera Venkatesh, again a well-known scientist from BARC, gave the third webinar and covered the applications of nuclear radiation for social welfare. The fourth webinar was by Mr. Tushar Pradhan on the exotic subject of science of creation of wealth, about which many of us have very little information or knowledge. We cherish so many items close to our heart, but how do we take care of our heart? Our fifth webinar was by Dr. Haresh G. Mehta, a distinguished cardiologist who unraveled many facts of our heart as he spoke on Heart is Your Password to Life. The sixth webinar was by Dr. Anita P. and Dr. Bindu Menon on artificial intelligence in neurological disorders. They showed how our technological innovations have played crucial roles in helping the medical science conquer the unconquered regimes and help mankind for better treatment. You have read from the abstract that Professor Godbole is going to tell us the story of the elementary particles and how mathematics is helping to understand their interactions. This will help us, she says, to comprehend the basic principles of the laws of nature. Professor Godbole is an inspired speaker, and I'm sure she will open up some Pandora's box of knowledge on this subject. I really look forward to listening to you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Devaki. I would now request Dr. Lalita Dhareshwar, our present president of Indian Women Scientists Association, to introduce our speaker. Dr. Lalita too is a physicist by profession, and she headed the Laser and Neutron Physics Department of BARC. followed by a 5-year Raja Ramanna Fellowship, which he served for the Institute, and later very actively took over the reins of IFSA. And we are looking forward for Lalita's talk, Lalita's introductory remark to introduce the speaker today.
Yes.
Over to you.
Thank you, Rita. And good afternoon to you all, my friends. I must say we are indeed extremely fortunate to have Padma Shri Professor Rohini Godbole as our 7th speaker of the series of these talks. And I have heard Professor Rohini Godbole on several occasions, and she is a speaker par excellence and very, very extremely motivating and inspiring person. And we are very proud to say that she is a member of our Indian Women Scientists Association. IWSA would be celebrating its Golden Jubilee in 2023. And we are proud to state that 2 of our founder members were also Padma awardees, Padma Bhushan Kamal Ranadive and Padma Shri Shanta Gandhi. And now we have the 3rd Padma Shri amongst us here. And Professor Rohini Madhusudan Godbole, she is a professor at the Indian Institute of Science at Bangalore, and she's a theoretical particle physicist. She was awarded the Padma Shri in 2019, and she is a fellow of all the science academies and the World Academy of Science also. She has won many awards and distinctions, out of which some recent ones are the Padma Shri of Government of India, the Distinguished Alumnus Award of the Indian Institute of Technology, Powai, S.N. Bose Medal of the INSA for Theoretical Physics, Meghnath Saha Award for Physics of the Asiatic Society of India, DST J.C. Bose Fellowship of the Government of India, R.D. Birla Award of the Indian Physics Association. She completed her BSc in 1972 from Pune University, and she got the first rank in the university. Then she completed her MSc in 1974 at the Indian Institute of Technology, Powai, where also she got the first rank and the Institute Silver Medal. She completed her PhD in 1979 from the State University of New York at Stony Brook, USA. And she did D.Lit from the SNDT Women's University, Mumbai in 2013. She superannuated from the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, and is now an honorary professor at the Center for High Energy Salam Theoretical Physics, Italy, visiting professor at the University of Dortmund, Germany, at CERN Geneva, Daisy Hamburg, and University of Utrecht, Netherlands, and most recently, Van der Waals Chair at the University of Amsterdam. She is an elected fellow of the 3 Science Academy of India, that is INSA, Indian National Science Academy, Indian Academy of Science, IISc, and National Academy of Science India, NASI, as well as the World Academy of Sciences. She has been the chief editor, Pramana, Indian Journal of Physics, from 2008 to 2016, and the associate editor from 1998 to 2008. She was the vice president of NASI. She was on the advisory board of the Oxford Research Encyclopedia for Physics. She was a member of the High Energy Physics Advisory Panel at USA. She has worked towards the pioneering a variety of programs at the various fora to raise awareness on the subject of women in science. She has co-edited a book, Leelavati's Daughters, Women Scientists of India, containing the autobiographical sketches of about 100 women scientists of India. This was released in 2005, and also she has written a book called A Girl's Guide to a Life in Science, which contains the material to inspire young girls to take up a life in science. She also directed a survey, Trained Scientific Women Power. What fraction are we losing and why? She has been the chair of INSA and IS panels for the Women in Science and a member of the same for the Association of the Asian Societies and Academies of Science. Today's talk, she is going to describe us the journey as how we as the humankind arrived at today's understanding of the elementary constituents of nature and the interactions among them. Equally important in this journey has been the development of the mathematical description of these interactions. She will be not talking about these in detail, but she will try to outline its importance and how it has provided us insight into the basic principles of the laws of nature. It is indeed a wonderful subject topic, and we are all waiting to hear you, Madam. Professor Rohini Godbole, I would like you to take over the stage and start your talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Malika. And Dr. Rohini, please, the forum is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Here there are all stalwarts and also quite a lot of friends who are in the audience. So it's a great pleasure. Oh, sorry, I made a mistake. It's a great pleasure to try and have this chat with you people in the program of IFSA on science and our life. And as I have heard, for example, the other talks have been, so to say, much closer to life, but I think my talk is going to be about something that I think drives, and this was already very well mentioned by Devaki as well as by Rita, and also that we are all curious beings, and that curiosity is an important part of our life. So I'm going to try and answer a question, which is, how do we know what lies within? So the plan of the lecture is roughly like this. I will have some introductory material as to what I want to talk about. And then I would try to tell you how the idea of what is elementary or what is fundamental constituent of matter or everything around us, how the idea itself has changed from the time of Democritus till now. And this will take me through a tale of molecules, atoms, and nuclei, words which all of us know very well. And then I will come to the things that normally, maybe we hear them in our 12th grade, maybe, but after that we forget. That is the story of the neutrons and the protons inside the nuclei. And then I will go to the next level, which is the story of fundamental particles and the fundamental interactions among them, which is what we particle physicists call the standard model of particle physics. And then I will basically come to this question, is this the last layer? Is this the final periodic table of the universe? And where does the understanding go further in this direction? So let's see how far I can get along. So, I like to think, and again, I really liked in Devaki's introduction, because as she said correctly, the development in human scientific understanding has actually revealed layers within layers within layers, And here I have taken two pictures, and at least the older member of the audience who are closer to me in age will remember that in the olden days, we would have these tins of oil or something. And then on that tin of oil, there will be a picture of a mother sitting and cooking. And in the kitchen, in the picture, there will be another tin. So it was a picture within picture within picture. So similarly, one of the thinking is that maybe as we go and start looking closer and closer, we start seeing that there is a, layer within layer within layer. Or the second question is matter like this, that it's like a Russian doll, where you start taking pieces at to a certain point, you think that, there is a piece within piece, but finally the last piece comes out and there is an innermost layer and then there is nothing. So particle physicists now tend to believe that the structure of matter is more like this picture that is shown on the right-hand side. It's like a Russian doll, and we think we have reached the last layer. So today I want to take you on a journey, and not really take a complete journey, but I would trace some parts of this journey, how the humankind has arrived today at understanding or the realization that the world around us is made up of some fundamental objects, but at the end of it, there are only some fundamental objects of which everything else is made up of. And I want to also show you that at each layer, when, because for example, when there's outermost doll, then there is one more doll, then there is one more doll. And at each level, it is the methods which have told us that there is yet something inside have been very, very similar. And it is these methods that I want to try and share with you and discuss with you. So, actually, to be honest, what makes the world around us? How does the world around us work? This is kind of the age-old query. And even if, we are discussing among friends about some particular issue, a naughty issue, you would always say, so what's the heart of the matter? What's the main issue? So how do the things around us are made? What are they all made up of, and how do they work? If everything around us made up of the same ultimate units, and if so, what holds them together? These have been the fundamental questions, which, if I'm not too wrong to say, I won't be too wrong to say that it is these questions, this curiosity about these things is what has driven the development of science as we know it today. And here, what I'm showing you is a very picture of a wonderful statue by a wonderful sculptor called Rodin. And this statue is called the Thinker. So indeed, the humanity has been thinking about these questions for a long, long time. So what are the bricks and the mortar of this beautiful edifice of life, of universe that's around us? The question has been the same through the ages. I would try to trace that for you. Answers have changed, and our perception of what the parts are has changed as our understanding as to how the parts are put together has increased. And as I already said, it won't be too wrong to say that efforts to answer this question has led to a large amount, to a large extent, the development of science in the early days. So, we started with the ideas of elements from the time of the Greeks, and also the Panchamahabhutas of the Indian sages. And then we went from elements to chemical elements, which came by the time when Mendeleev came around. Then from chemical elements, one realized that fundamental object is a molecule. From the molecule, we came down to level that molecules are made up of atoms. Then we realized that atoms are made up of nuclei and electrons. And finally, one realized that the nuclei are made up of neutrons and protons, and the neutrons and protons are made up of quarks. So that's where the journey stopped. And this subject, which deals with quarks, leptons, and what binds the quarks together to make a proton, make a neutron, which will then make nuclei, which will make then atoms with electrons, which will make them molecules, which will then make them chemical elements, and which will make everything around us. So today, the subject of elementary particle physics is the last step in answering the question, what is the world around us is made up of? And the fundamental, accepted worldview, I will just use these words. I will spend some amount of time in coming slides onto this. But what we do know is that the fundamental particles are what we call quarks. I will come to this. If these are just words, we will talk about it a little bit later. And something called the light particles called leptons. And it's not just enough that there are fundamental particles. There are also only 4 fundamental forces, and the forces which are carried by exchanges of fundamental particles again, which are the photon, the WZ boson, and the gluon, and of course, the final piece of the puzzle, the Higgs boson. And what is interesting is that, you could kind of say that this is a matter of interest to maybe 10,000 particle physicists in the world. Why should this be of interest to everybody? The point is that the laws of physics, which particle physicists study and understand, that which govern the behavior of these elemental blocks, actually, in principle, allows us to predict behavior of all matter. And that is the beauty, at all distance scales and at all time scales. So this is the subject of elementary particle physics. And as I said, it deals with what are the elementary constituents of matter, what holds these constituents together, and last but not the least, what is the mathematical framework to describe how the constituents are put together to form matter, how do they talk to each other, and how can one predict its behavior under different conditions. So this is what the subject of fundamental particle physics is, and it is the subject which today answers the question of what are we made up of. And the answers, of 2 and 3, okay, if we try to understand 2 and 3, actually has led us to believe and understand a very important role which is played by something which we call symmetries in the description of interactions. If you don't like the symmetries, think about regularities. And these regularities, understanding, a theoretical understanding of these regularities actually led to the prediction of new interactions, new particles like the Higgs boson before they were found. So the essential process by which the structure of matter got revealed has been a combination of these two steps in the understanding of what are the fundamental building blocks of matter. So let's just begin at the beginning. There are mainly two different ways in which we scientists have inferred about what lies at the heart of matter. One is the very static methods. That means that you use systematics that is observed in the properties of the system. Okay, and for example, you say that atomic weights of all the elements seem to be close to whole multiples of the hydrogen atom. Now that tells you already that maybe hydrogen atom is a fundamental unit. So this kind of regularities in the properties of the systems that one sees, and for a gas, for example, the pressure, volume, or mass of atomic weights, or the spins, and these regularities sometimes helps to understand whether there is a fundamental constituent at the heart of the matter or not. And the other word for these regularities is what is symmetry. And the other kind of experiment is the experiment when you actually take one which we call static methods and another method which we call scattering experiments. And actually what happens is that in the scattering experiments, you can probe the structure only when you have some understanding of what causes the scattering. And what I want to show you through, now we will begin in the next slide, is the interplay of these two methods, the static methods and the scattering experiments. That means ideas of symmetry, which are theoretical descriptions of some aspects of particle interaction, and scattering experiments have gone hand in hand, and the baton has passed from one method to another, which has essentially finally revealed to us what is the fundamental constituent of nature. So let me begin at the again sort of start as which I had mentioned in words. Let me here a standard model, which is the list of our fundamental particles. Those are the quarks and the leptons that I put up there. So quarks and leptons, these are all spin half. They carry spin in units of h cross, and these are half integral spins. And for example, 2 up quarks and 1 down quark makes a proton, 2 down quark and 1 up quark makes a neutron. And then we learned that the protons and neutrons will make nuclei. Protons and neutrons with the nuclei will make, with an electron, will make atoms. And then the story is complete. But these up-down quarks and the electron are the particles which are essential to see the matter that's all around us. On the other hand, there is one piece of matter that is all around us, that is the neutrinos, which come from the sun, but which we do not see. They are in large numbers. So this one generation, this one block, makes up for all the particles. I want to now go back and say how were particles discovered. Here I am telling you that this most important particle, Higgs, was predicted by theory, and actually finding it was sort of the crowning glory of the Standard Model. Was it always so? Actually, no. What happened was, for example, electron was discovered quite a bit accidentally, but it matched with what was expected on the grounds of observed patterns and systematics. And that happened in 1897 to 1899. The positron was actually predicted, and it was predicted by a very famous physicist called Dirac, Paul Dirac, because he said if quantum mechanics of an electron has to be coexist and be consistent with special theory of relativity, then a positron must exist. So this was a bit like the Higgs. It was predicted and then found. Electron was discovered accidentally, but it matched with what people were expecting from the static properties, that is the observed patterns and systematics. Mu minus just came along for the ride, unlooked for, unexpected, but once we found it, the studies furthered our understanding of fundamental interaction in no mean way. Pi plus pi minus, these were predicted by Yukawa in 1935, and neutrino was postulated by Pauli in 1931, again on basis of symmetries, and both were found in experiments in 1947. The nucleus was discovered quite accidentally by Rutherford, whereas the quarks UDS were postulated in 1961 from study of static properties, but they were discovered in the scattering experiments. The heavier quarks and leptons, one of them the charm quark, remember I gave you many list of particles, that was predicted by the Standard Model as it existed in 1972 actually, and the actual discovery was actually quite accidental, and it was in 1974 when that experiment was not constructed to look for the charm quark, but it came, and then one realized, oh my god, this is the charm quark that theorists have been predicting. So that was a bit like the electron, which was expected by, so to say, the theorists, and which was discovered experimentally quite accidentally. On the other hand, the B, the tau, were not required to exist, but they were found unlooked for in 1974 and 1977. But once these were found, one knew that the top quark had to exist if the Standard Model of the particle interactions was right, and further its mass was predicted, and it was found in 1995. What was the point of giving you this slide? The point of giving you this slide is to show you the interplay between the predicting a particle's existence through our knowledge of the symmetries of the dynamics, and sometimes finding it in the scattering experiment accidentally. So, what are the sizes of these fundamental objects? Let's try to get some understanding of the sizes and the constituents of matter at different length scales. So we have already agreed that everything is made up of molecules. Molecules are made up of atoms. Atoms are made up of nuclei and electrons. And now we begin and start measuring everything in atomic sizes. Okay. So this is the size of an atom. Okay. Let's say in meters, for those of you who don't like numbers, it's 10 to the minus 10 meters. Whereas this atom, as we know, consists of a nucleus, and the size of the nucleus is actually of the 4 orders of magnitude smaller. So it is 10,000 times smaller than an atomic size. So nuclear sizes are 10,000 times smaller than the atomic sizes, whereas a proton inside the nucleus, which is also not elementary, it's another factor of 10 smaller. That means on the whole, it's 100,000 times smaller than an atom. And for a quark, actually, we only have a limit. That if the quark does have a size, its size is less than 100,000 times the size of an atom. And actually, I will argue at the end of the talk that we think that quarks are not made up of something further. Quarks seem to be the ultimate building blocks of matter as we see it. On the other hand, there is an electron, and the size of an electron also we believe is not there, and it is a point particle, and only experimentally all we know is that its limit is less than 100,000 size. Its size is less than 100,000 times smaller than an atom. Now, these are the quarks and leptons, which are 100 million times smaller than an atom, and we believe them to be indivisible or point-like. And atoms, remember, we all know the size of an atom. It's, 10 to the minus 10 meters, and an angstrom, remember, is 10 to the minus 8 meters. And experiments at high energy accelerators and the development of theoretical models went hand in hand to arrive at this picture and arrive at this answer. And what I also want to show you here, that if you were born in the time of Rutherford, you would have thought that this is a point. And you would have said, if you were born before Rutherford, you would have said the atom is a point. So the idea as to what is fundamental and what are the sizes of different objects evolved as the time has evolved. So if you really went back to the BC, and if you ask the question, what was the branch of physics dealing with heart of matter at that time? Okay, so the first concept came as atoms, as the smallest indivisible part of matter, and this was introduced by Democritus. And I want to reproduce the statement that was written by him. He said, by convention there is color, by convention sweetness, by convention bitterness, but in reality there are only atoms and space. So this is the similar statement was made by Kanada in Vaisheshika Sutras. But the point is, these were only philosophical statements. At this point, there was no proof, there was no testing of this hypothesis. And the branch of knowledge dealing with this understanding of elementarity of matter would have been philosophy at that time. Then the next big progress came at the time of Newton, where optics, he defined a process of substantiating the idea. He said, the smallest particle of matter may cohere by the strongest attractions and compose bigger particles of weaker virtue. There are therefore agents in nature able to make particles of bodies stick together by very strong interactions, and it is the business of experimental philosophy to find them out. So if you like, at this point, the branch of science that is dealing with what lies at the heart of matter was experimental philosophy. So from the thermodynamics, which describe three states of matter, scientists graduated to Mendeleev's idea of chemical elements, which, remember, was arrived at using systematics of observed properties of the various objects. This then led to Dalton's idea of atoms, which were actually really molecules, and the order in atomic weights led to the idea of proton, I already told you. So at that time, when we only knew the atomic weights and atomic idea of elements, then chemistry and atomic physics would have been the branch of science which explored the fundamental constituents of matter. Now, chemists actually used to think that atoms are only a mathematical artifact. They used to say there is no direct proof. And you will see that this came again and again as we were trying to understand what lies at the heart of matter. In fact, kinetic theory of gases, which all of us who study science we find that the first principle derivation of the properties of gases actually proved, in some sense, the atomicity. But the non-believers had to wait till Einstein gave his theory of Brownian motion. So now here is where the role of dynamics to fulfill Newton's order completely was actually, to be seen, that the kinetic theory of gases proved that atoms exist and atoms had arrived. So beyond this point, how important is this idea of atomicity? There is a statement by a very, very famous scientist, some of you will know him, one of the most famous physicists of the 20th century called Richard Feynman. He made a statement. If all the scientific knowledge in the world were to be destroyed and I can choose only one piece of understanding to be passed on to the future, I would choose to pass on the message that matter is composed of atoms ceaselessly moving and bouncing against each other. And I think I have tried to sketch here very briefly how we arrived at this fundamental and very important idea of atomicity. Now, if we go to the second part of the 19th century, at this point, people were familiar with atoms, people were happy with knowing atoms, people had realized that all the atomic weights seemed to be close to integral multiples of hydrogen atom, atomic weight of all the objects. At this point, Faraday actually came and showed that the electricity also comes in multiples of basic unit. And then, as I already told you, this was sort of Faraday's experiments had kind of made people expect that maybe there is a fundamental unit of electricity. And lo and behold, Thomson's cathode ray experiments and his discovery of the electron actually showed that he found a particle whose mass to charge ratio was different than that of the hydrogen ion. And since at that time people had thought that everything is made up of hydrogen atoms, now here was a new type of particle, and this was the first elementary particle. So if you like, in 1897, discovery of the electron by Thomson was really the birth of the world of fundamental particles. So now let me try to go through very briefly the basic processes which happened in the transition from electron being a mathematical entity, as pointed out by Mr. Faraday, to the physical reality. It happened very fast, only in 3 years. Compared to that, the Higgs had to wait from in 1961. It was postulated and it was discovered in 2012. So you can see time scales are very different. So observation by Faraday that the electricity comes in units of patterns in ionization. This he found out by looking at studying ionization of just sending a current through a liquid and looking at what is the charges that are collected at two different electrodes. The experiments which were made by Thomson using cathode rays, where he showed that the cathode rays behave under the action of electric and magnetic fields as though they consist of particles with ratio of charge to mass quite different from the hydrogen atom. So hydrogen ion. So these two were the two steps, but this still did not mean that the electron or the cathode rays that Thomson has seen in a cathode ray tube, is the same electron that exists inside the atom, hydrogen atom, which combines with the hydrogen ion to make the hydrogen atom. But this was confirmed by a measurement by Zeeman of the splitting of the atomic spectral lines in a magnetic field and finding a value in agreement with the predicted value using ideas by Lorentz if an electron with that value of E by m should be inside the atom. So now you see the three different steps. This is from the static properties, by looking at the properties, systematics. Somebody predicted it. Electron was found in cathode ray. That is, a particle with a charge E by m ratio different from hydrogen ion was found in the experiments. And then came Zeeman with actually giving a theory of atomic spectral lines, where he found that the splitting of a spectral line in a magnetic field can be explained if a particle with the same charge to mass ratio that Thomson had found existed inside the atom. So this is the transition from a mathematical entity to a physical reality that happens in the world of fundamental particles. For example, in 1811, Thomson kept on thinking that his model of atom was basically like a plum pudding or a cake, where the electrons are sticking out like plums from the center of a cake, and which is basically some liquid or pudding and even a cake. Rutherford actually did an experiment, and it's a scattering experiment which shaped the physics of the century. What was this experiment? We all know it, but I'm going to go through it because of its similarity with the experiments at much higher energies, which again helped us to find the structure of matter at deeper and deeper levels. So what was Rutherford's experiment? He had a radioactive decaying nucleus, which was alpha particle. This source of alpha particle was incident on a thin golden foil. So this was the beam, this was the target, and he was looking at scattered alpha particles by a detector, and his detector was nothing but a microscope, and when the alpha particles hit this zinc sulfide screen, they produce scintillations. So this microscope was the detector, this microscope zinc sulfide screen made a detector. So there is a beam, there is a target, and there is a detector, and you are studying the scattering of alpha particles from the thin golden foil. So that is the macroscopic body. Alpha particle is your beam, and this beam of particles got scattered. Now, what was the experiment? What was the result that surprised everybody? What surprised everybody is that most of the alpha particles went through undeflected. But once in a blue moon, actually they rebounded. They completely came backwards. And Rutherford actually concluded from this that atom has a point-like nucleus. Now, why? I have written this. So let us now understand how this fact that studying the angular distribution of alpha particles scattered from the thin gold foil. What is meant by angular distribution is that you know the number of alpha particles that are hitting on this thin gold foil. You look at the number of alpha particles that are arriving at different angles, and you expect, actually most of the time, that you expected that alpha particles scattered will keep on going, continuing their journey. But what they found is that sometimes some of the alpha particles were actually came backwards, that the microscope was in this direction, and they still found some scattered alpha particle. So what does that mean? Why did this indicate that the positive charge of the atom is a point? So this is very easy to understand, and I will just first explain or state the wonder that Rutherford had placed. He said this particular experimental result, that sometimes the alpha particles came back at you, was about as credible as if you had fired a 15-inch shell at a piece of tissue paper and it came back and hit you. Why? Because if the atom consisted of some material, then the alpha particles should have got scattered and got maybe slightly changed in their direction. But if they're being hit, they're being pushed back, that means that there is something happening here. And I want to give you an example. The example is, think of yourself, you're standing and you're wanting to cross a road. And then what you find while you're trying to, there is in the middle of the road, there is an accident. People are peering as to what has happened. Now, when you're walking, and trying to cross the road, if you walk such that you avoid the area where this knot is, where the people are there, you can peacefully continue along your own direction. But if you happen to go in the area where there is this knot of people, you will be pushed back. So it's exactly like that most of the alpha particles didn't see anything. They were going around the charge in the atom. So they were able to, so most of them were able to go around the positive charge, but that means that the positive charge must have been concentrated in a very small region, and therefore most of the alpha particles didn't really see anything to interact with and continued their merry journey like you would cross the road and without even knowing what's happening. And only when your path happened to intersect with that knot, then indeed you were pushed back. So this means that alpha particles can actually look inside the atom to see the size of the region which contained the positive charge. So the picture is here. So these are alpha particles which are coming. This is the atom, and most of the time this is the atom. Essentially, it's supposed to be all over the place, and most of the time the alpha particles see only empty space, so they continue or get deflected very mildly. But when they come head on or they come close to this, then they are returned back. So here, if you plotted the number of counts as a function of the angle, what you found is that what if the atom had no substructure, if there is no such thing as space and a very small region where the charge is concentrated, then you would have expected the then actually you would have expected a very different angular distribution. And instead of that, now because the particle, the atom has a substructure, you start seeing much larger number of particles, scattered particles at accounts at larger angles than you would have otherwise expected. So what I will not go into the calculation, but now this is where the point comes, that knowing what is the Coulomb interaction between the alpha particles and the positively charged nucleus, one can actually calculate that what if this charge is a point charge as opposed to what if the charge is distributed over a region of radius r. And if the alpha particle is coming like this, if the alpha particle is passing like this, let's say, then as long as the alpha particle will pass a distance away from this spatial extension, it will go undeflected. Only when the alpha particle comes here, it will be heavily deflected. And this angular distribution you can compute knowing what is the charge distribution of the charge inside the atom. And when you calculate it, theoretically, knowing the dynamics of the scattering process, you can actually calculate the number of scattered alpha particles at a given angle, and you can compare them with the expectation for a point charge. And what you can show, and this is all matter of mathematics, which we need not go into, this factor comes to be some function of a quantity q square, which is a function both of the energy of the incoming particle and energy of the scattered particle and the angle of the scattered particle. Okay, this is the same thing I have repeated here. So this f of q square will then depend on the size of the charge distribution. If the charge distribution is in fact a point distribution, in that case, the f of q square will be simply 1, because what I have just now said, that it is the modification compared to the expectation from a point charge is defined by f of q square. So if f of q square is 1 for all q square that for which you are doing experiments, then you will say what you are seeing is a point object. On the other hand, if you do an experiment and you do find a f of q square that is different from 1, this is the example of the experimental result, then you will say, aha, now I know that there is a structure to my scattering center, but do I know anything more than that? So actually you can do much more quantitative, which again we won't do, but what we can show is that if say r is the radius, let's say the nucleus was a spherical charge distribution of radius r. Supposing r was the radius of that charge distribution. As long as the quantity which I have calculated here, e times 1 minus cosine theta, as long as this quantity is much, much less than 1 over r square, we can show that f of q square is, that is the factor by which the number of events are going to change, is 1 minus r square q square. If r square times q square is much less than 1, f of q square is very close to 1, and therefore, if the energies of your probe are such that the q square is much, much smaller than the inverse size of the body, then you will. So this is why it explains that Rutherford found the nucleus to be point-like, even though today we all know that it has the size of the order of a few Fermis that I've already told you. So it shows you that our ability to infer and study structure of an object from scattering experiments is only possible when we have high enough energies, because remember, this q square depends on the energy for E prime. Only when we have large enough energies such that r square times q square is of the order 1. That means smaller the spatial extension, higher is the energy that is required. So now I have given you the complete story that the existence of atoms was inferred from many properties of the matter on macroscopic scales, but for the nucleus, the first indication of its existence came from this scattering experiment. Now what happened afterwards? What happened afterwards, that in 1914, if you were, you were a scientist and you lived in 1914, you would have actually, that is just after Rutherford's experiment, you would have said that everything is made up of molecules which are made up of atoms which contain electrons in a lot of empty space and positively charged point nuclei. And this was then the decade of atomic physics and nuclear physics. Discovery of radioactivity played a big role in this period and these discoveries. And then after the nucleus was found accidentally in a scattering experiment, the further studies in of the radioactivity actually started telling people about the properties of the nuclei. Then they found that the mass of the nuclei was in approximate integral multiples of hydrogen nucleus. Then they started seeing patterns in nuclear masses. Their spin angular momenta were measured, and that now regularity in these static properties told people, and Rutherford actually played a very important role in this further study of nuclear physics too, where they found that the nuclei are also made up of protons and neutrons, more fundamental building blocks. And at that time, so what I'm really trying to show you that in 1914 or 1918, our experiments told us that nucleus was a point particle because Rutherford saw f of q square was of the order 1 in his experiment for the nucleus, not for the atoms. Okay, so you knew nucleus was a point-like particle, but at the same time, nucleus, we thought nucleus was a point-like. We couldn't measure the size of a nucleus, the size to a distance smaller than the nuclear size, but at that time, we already knew from the static property measurements that the nucleus are not points, but they are made up of more constituents. So the fundamental objects at this point in 1914 would have been the photon, the electron, the proton, and the neutron. And one more, which was the neutrino, which was postulated by Pauli a little bit later in 1931. So why did Pauli postulate it? So in beta decays, a nucleus with Z protons and N neutrons goes into another nucleus which contains Z minus plus 1 proton and N plus minus 1 neutron. So either the number of protons decreases by 1 and number of neutrons increases by 1, or the number of protons increases by 1 and the number of neutrons decreases by 1 in beta decay. So effectively, inside a nucleus, a proton converts into a neutron or vice versa, and a positron and electron is emitted. Now, in this case, the beta decay, as well as later on people found a free neutron to be decayed, and the free neutron decayed and was found by Chadwick in 1936. So now we came quite a bit away from 1914. This was experimentation that was happening. And then one found that the neutron decays into a proton and an electron. But what happened was that the electron seemed to have an energy which was varying continuously. Now, if it was just a neutron decaying into proton plus electron, and if energy was conserved, then the electron should have had a fixed energy. But that was not happening. So what was happening to the energy? Where was the energy missing? And this was therefore at variance with the conservation of energy and also of linear momentum, because neutron was sitting at rest. You produce a proton which was also sitting at rest, and an electron was flying away with a lot of velocity. I mean, this is something we learn in school, where energy and momentum are conserved. So what was happening? And this is where a small neutron or a neutrino was postulated by Pauli to preserve the conservation of energy, angular momentum in nuclear beta decay. So again, now I give you an example how the neutrons, protons were inferred, existence of neutrons and protons was inferred by regularity of the nuclei, the properties of the nuclei. But by looking at the properties of the beta decay and the neutron decay itself, some theoretical requirement that energy and the momentum should be conserved indeed forced Pauli to postulate a new particle called neutrino. And actually, though this is the point is, which again something that I won't have time, but this is what I meant by saying that I will give you a flavor, is that why this conservation of energy and angular momentum or the linear momentum is so sacrosanct? It is because all the conservation laws are related to some symmetry or the other. In fact, this is a statement which was given to us by a very famous woman, mathematician. Her name is Amy Noether. So Amy Noether actually told us that conservation of these quantities is actually indeed because of some symmetry of the laws of nature. So for example, conservation of linear momentum follows by realizing that laws of physics do not depend on the position where the experiment is performed. Now, you would say that this is a very, very simple requirement. If I measure the lifetime of a time of a oscillation time of a pendulum and sitting here on my table, and you measure the lifetime of a pendulum in your table, as long as the length of the the tension in the pendulum is the same, we are going to get exactly the same answer. So therefore, conservation of linear momentum cannot be violated because it will violate something that just cannot be true, namely that laws of physics, there is no spatial point in this space around us. And this particular relationship between symmetries of laws of nature and actual properties of the observed particle, this is the first example that I wanted to give you. Now, again, I repeat that we found that the nucleon structure of a nucleus was arrived. Nucleus itself was found in a scattering experiment. It was not expected that it was a point-like nucleus. Now, at that time, even then we thought that by scattering experiments were telling us that the nuclei were point-like. We found that the nucleus does have structure, does have constituents, and that was obtained from the static properties of nuclei. And the nucleons, which are neutrons and protons, were found outside the nucleus. That is when we realized that, yes, indeed, these are the constituents of nuclei. But now there are a few facts. Neutron and proton have very, very similar masses. All the nuclei are formed with them, and both have a spin in units of h cross, Planck's constant, half. Two protons, one proton and one neutron, and two neutrons. Forces among these inside a nuclei are very, very similar in strength and range. This is something people studied in nuclear physics and understood by measuring the properties of nuclei, of various nuclei. So then came a very imaginative physicist called Heisenberg, who came and said that one can imagine the protons and neutrons as the two states of a particle, which we will call nucleon. And just like an electron with spin up, spin half, can exist in two different states, one with a spin parallel to the z-axis and one with a spin anti-parallel to the z-axis, the nucleon with an internal spin in the up direction, we will call it a proton. Nucleon with an internal spin in the down direction, we will call a neutron. At this point, this was a complete mathematical entity. Nucleon is actually a big spin half particle. With its spin up direction in this internal space, it is a proton. If it's a downward spin, it's a neutron. And just like, as long as there is no magnetic field, the properties of a spin up electron and a spin down electron, its interactions with electromagnetic field remain exactly the same way a nucleon, in the interaction of two nucleons, it doesn't matter if one of them is a proton and other one is a neutron, or both of them are protons or both of them are neutrons. That means that under a rotation in this internal space, because let me go back for a minute. When I say an electron has a spin in the along the z-axis, plus z-axis, if I just decided to rotate my coordinate axis, and instead of saying that my z, I make a rotation, and what I can call a new coordinate system where my z-axis is exactly in the opposite direction, laws of physics cannot change with that. And that means that seemingly a spin up electron has gone down to spin half, changed into spin half electron. And if that laws of physics do not depend on that, it means that that electron will spin up and electron will spin down are one and the same. So this is a reflection of the fact that the laws of motion are independent under a rotation of coordinates. Similarly, the laws of interaction between two nucleons are symmetric under a rotation in this internal space, and this is the first introduction to the symmetries of the laws of particle physics. That's why I'm spending a bit of time on it, and this is an imaginary symmetry that is being talked about. So exactly the point that I was making, that this is an internal symmetry. A rotation in real space can change a state of electron with spin along the positive z-axis to a state of spin with along the negative z-axis. And in the presence of only an electric static potential, which is proportional to 1 by r, we cannot detect the difference between these two states. And this fact related to actually the fact that the potential is a function only of the modulus of the distance and not of the direction between the separation between the two charges. So just like the rotation in the real space converts an electron with spin along positive z-axis to a state with spin along the negative z-axis, a rotation in this hypothetical internal space converts a nucleon in the spin-up state into a nucleon in a spin-down state, that is the neutron. And therefore, the observed fact that these three forces are one and the same is interpreted to say that the mathematical description of the interaction among the two protons or the two neutrons or one proton and one neutron remains unchanged or is invariant under a rotation inside in this internal spin space which you are imagining, which exists only in the imagination of a theoretical physicist. But lo and behold, this actually is something that helped us further to project, to help people like Gell-Mann, I will talk about it in a minute, to predict existence of different kinds of particles which were till that time not seen in nature. So let's hold on to this. Now, I hope you are not too uncomfortable. I'm trying to show you how some of the things were arrived at by looking at the systematics, looking at the static properties, and some that helped formulating certain theory, certain theoretical constructs, postulating certain symmetries, and then those symmetries, their predictions were tested in further experiments. So let's go on with this. Let's remember this idea of an internal symmetry. So around 1945 or 47, so this is, now we have gone from about 34 years after this idea that I have just now told you. And this was a discovery of a zoo of particles in cosmic rays. Actually, India took a quite hefty part in these cosmic ray experiments, and one found that there were large number of particles like the proton and the neutron. So the approach we had in 1912, which you would have had in 1914 or 1925, that the protons and neutrons are fundamental, was breaking down. Already there were indications that, I will come to that, so let me hold back. So one realized that all of them cannot be really fundamental, and Gell-Mann and Zweig actually presented an extension of this I-spin idea that I explained in a lot of detail, and they extended it to say that inside a proton, just like the protons and neutrons were isospin, proton and neutron were a part of an isospin doublet. Now they postulated new kinds of particles, up quark or a down quark, and up quark and down quark together formed an isospin multiplet. And then there came an additional particle that they postulated called S, which then they said that U, D, and S, these had some fundamental internal symmetry among them. And then they were able to show that all the observed heavy particles which were seen in these cosmic ray experiments, that is the proton, lambda, neutron, pi plus, k naught, pi naught, j psi, all kinds of particles. And they were able to show that all the heavy particles, the baryons and the mesons, are made up of even fundamental objects called quarks. And this was the idea, this idea was actually an extension of the I-spin idea that I have tried to tell you. So this was in 1964, where U, D, and S quarks had really arrived. Charm bottom and top is a different story. We will not go into it here. But now here I am showing you that in trying to make sense of this whole lot of fundamental, quote unquote, heavy particles that were noticed, and since they all couldn't be fundamental, the order could be restored by observed order in their properties. Gell-Mann and Zweig had predicted that indeed these objects are made up of yet another fundamental constituents. So again, observation by Gell-Mann and Zweig, which came from pattern and the regularity that was exhibited in the properties of the members of the particle zoo, and they predicted that all of this can be understood if they are made up of a smaller number of constituent quarks. This is very similar to concluding that nuclei were made up of neutrons and protons, because all the mass numbers of all the nuclei were roughly integral multiples of the proton or neutron mass. And till that time, in 1964, people tried a lot of experiments and people could not break the proton or neutron into quarks. So therefore, most of the people actually said, just like the chemists in the early times, that this up quark, down quark are facts of fantasy. They are mathematical objects. Remember, I told you in the discovery of the electron, I had said that there exist three stages. One, that it is a mathematical entity, then some discovery, and then understanding it in a theoretical framework. So at this point, people took the same view as chemists took of the atoms, and they said quarks are not really real. They are just a mathematical object, and it helps us to calculate their property. And reason for that actually was very simple, because if Dalman's calculations were correct, then these particles, quarks, have to have fractional electric charges, 1/3 or 2/3 the charge of an electron. And therefore, many of the physicists decided that no, these are not fundamental particles, they are mathematical objects. It's even worse, that there is another fundamental principle called Pauli's exclusion principle, and this is again something that all laws of quantum mechanics must satisfy. And if they had to be satisfied, then one said that it is not enough just to say that these up quarks and the down quarks have fractional charges, but they will also have to possess an additional property which we call color, which means that there exist three types of up quarks, U1, U2, U3, three types of down quarks, D1, D2, T3, etc., etc. So people were really not ready to believe in quarks as an idea. But what happened is that based on this particular symmetry idea, Gell-Mann actually predicted the existence and the mass of a particular particle called omega. And it was experimentally found. And Gell-Mann even got the Nobel Prize. He was a famous physicist at Caltech. So now people sort of sat back and said, aha, this seems to have a lot of implication for real life. So where are these quarks hiding? Can you do a Rutherford type of experiment to see them in a scattering experiment? Why can't they appear in free space? Can we try to break open a proton? Then we'll see them. Like we ionize an atom and then we see electrons separately and a charged ion separately. Or when you hit a neutron on a nucleus, the nucleus breaks up. I mean, that's actually part of nuclear reaction and produces two different types of nuclei. So can we do something like that? Why is that not happening? This was the question that people had in 1964. Before I go further, let me try to explain something which I had kind of only touched upon, and that has to do with this fact that if the nucleus is made up of nucleons and nucleons are made up of quarks, why did Rutherford see the nucleus as a point? So how do we measure sizes of objects? How do we resolve them into their constituents? Now here I want to remind you that de Broglie taught us that photon behaved as a wave and a particle. Same is true of the electron, and this is the same as wave-particle duality. So now you remember that we could see microscopes to see things, right? If the resolving power is higher, smaller is the wavelength. Now, if the wavelength associated with electron lambda is given by, according to de Broglie, by some constant 1 over magnitude of the momentum. So you say, if the momentum is large, then the wavelength will be small. So if I can use very high energy electron, maybe I can measure smaller and smaller distances. So you use high energy particles to see things at smaller distances. Higher the energy, shorter the wavelength, better the resolution. Now Rutherford had used alpha particles to look inside the atom. Alpha particles had an energy of MeV. If we use this formula and do some complicated, not very complicated calculation, you find that the wavelengths are of the order of about 10 to the minus 10 to 10 to the minus 12 meters. As a result of that, its resolving power is bigger than the size of an atom, but it's smaller, okay, than the size of a nucleus. And nucleus size is smaller than this resolution, So Rutherford actually saw that atom as a nucleus, as a point. And therefore, if you want to look at smaller and smaller objects, this is a scale for you. And I will not go in all these details, but here, if I want to look at smaller and smaller distances, for example, if I want to look at DNA, I need an electron microscope. If I'm looking at a nucleus, I want to look at the accelerators. I want to increase the energy, and then I can probe smaller and smaller distances. So now these are the three logical steps, and now I'm going to go over to the quarks after this. Because what has happened is that we have unveiled a structure in three different spaces. One is the regularities and patterns in properties such as masses, spins. They reflect possible existence of a basically Moore unit, like the nuclei. The properties of the nuclei said that perhaps the nuclei are made up of constituents. But then you want to measure the size of the constituents, and which at the level of atomic distance, since are smaller, measuring the size of the constituent is simply doing the scattering experiment using beams of higher and higher energy. And this is the sort of, at the atomic level, this was Rutherford's experiment. Now at the nuclear level and at the level of a proton, this is going to be the next level experiment that I'm going to tell you about, and that will complete the picture. But as I keep on saying, a parallel and necessary step has been the development of the theory of the dynamics that holds these things together. And then one sees if the observed properties of the composites agree with the predictions of the theory, like the omega particle, which was predicted and had the mass that was actually predicted. So these are the three different steps. So there, to study atomic analog of Rutherford's experiment at the nuclear level was a very famous experiment called Hofstadter experiment. And this Hofstadter experiment was actually the nucleus and proton version of the same experiment. As I said, you needed high energy beams. I will remove this. This is not so important. So his experiment was simple. There is a beam of electron, and now the electrons are accelerated to a much higher energy. It is that energy is of the order of million electron volts. And electron volt is the energy that an electron gains when it falls through a potential difference of 1. Remember, I had told you in Rutherford's experiment, there was a beam, there was a target, and there is a detector. Now the target was a nucleus, beam was an electron beam, and the detector was actually something very useful. So this was the electrons were produced somewhere here, and they traveled across this line. This is the 1 mile line long accelerator at SLAC, Stanford Linear Accelerator. And then there was this detector in this lab, in this building. And please see the size of this detector. This is the size of a person. So the experiments have gone much bigger than the simple experiment that Rutherford did. And it revealed something now experimentally, that the nucleus and the proton have a finite size. How did they do that? They measured the number of scattered electrons at a given angle, exactly like Rutherford, and calculated the ratio of the observed with the expectation of a point-like nucleus or proton, which was calculated by known dynamics. And then one found that as long as the energy of the electron was such that the wavelength was much bigger than the radius, the size of the target, then basically the results were you will have the F that I calculated would be 1. But when the wavelength of the electron became close to the size of the target, the ratio started differing from 1. And this value, wavelength of the electron at which this happened, gave you an idea of the size of the nucleus or a proton. And it was they were able to measure that nuclei were about 10,000 to 100,000 times smaller than atoms, which is exactly what I wrote in depicted in the first plot that I showed you. So establishing that the nucleus had a finite size, everybody was happy, because just like the case of an electron, which was expected from Faraday's measurements, but it was nice to see it really, the mathematical reality to be in real life. Similarly, one had expected that the nucleus had to have a finite size because it was made up of neutrons and protons, but it was nice to know what was the extent of that size. So people were very happy at the nuclear level. But then people said, what about the proton? Remember, Gell-Mann's idea, Gell-Mann's theory had told you that even the proton is not point-like. So what I did, already people were uncomfortable with the fact that the proton is point-like, that the proton is fundamental. And I already told you the reason for that, because that's what led actually Gell-Mann to postulate that there are quarks. The one thing was that the proton had a G ratio. This is only for physicists. Non-physicists will not understand it. But proton has a particular quantity, that is the effect of the magnetic moment on a proton spin, for example, is measured by a factor called gyromagnetic ratio. And this gyromagnetic ratio was very different from the value 2 that a spin half particle should have according to the Dirac equation. And neutron, which is neutral, should have no magnetic moment at all, but the experimental measurements had said that a neutron has a magnetic moment. So this had already told in a very different way that the protons and neutrons must not be point particles. So now I'm giving you two different directions by which you had indications that the neutron and proton are not point-like, but one was by postulating a particular set of constituents. Other was just saying they are not point-like, they may not be elementary, but they may not have constituents necessary. So for that, it was necessary to measure the spatial extension of the charge distribution of cell proton and neutron. And that is where Hofstadter did an experiment where an electron with a given energy E was incident on a proton, and he always measured the scattered electron energy. And remember, scattered electron at a energy, I will show you this picture, the electron was coming like this, and then it was scattered, and this big apparatus could be moved a little bit at few fixed angles, so they were able to measure the energy of the scattered electron and the angle of the scattered electron. And again, these measurements, exactly like Rutherford's experiment, when you change the energy at lambda E of the order of radius of the proton, you expected the predictions based on the point-like structure to differ from what was observed. And indeed, it was seen that the proton is not point-like and its size is 100,000 times smaller than an atom, which was 1 Fermi. So this confirmed the inference which people had got by looking at the measurements of static properties. Now I have to give you the next surprise, and that would be the sort of the crowning glory. The surprise came when the energy of the electron was increased even further. So earlier, one energy of the electron was a few hundred MeV. Then to see the structure of a proton, because it was 10 times smaller than the nuclear size, you required 10 times more energy. So you required about 3000 MeV to 2000 MeV to 3000 MeV energy. And now when you increase the energy to further to 10,000 to 20,000 million electron volts, that means now we have gone by order of magnitude higher energy. We have gone in principle to a beam which has a resolution which is 100 times smaller than the proton and the neutron. The size of the proton was measured already. So now when people started doing these experiments, actually what they found is that at a given scattering angle, the electrons seem to have various different energies. Conservation of angular linear momentum and energy would have told you that if it was the proton against which the electron was scattering, then at a fixed angle of scattering, the energy should be fixed. The fact that the energy of the electron at a fixed angle of scattering is changing is equivalent to the picture of Rutherford, where the number of alpha particles at larger angles were larger than expected if it was a point-like object. So this kind of started telling them that maybe the proton had something inside it. When they increased this energy even further, the scattered electron again began to have a unique value of E naught prime, but which was different from what it had for when they were scattering from a proton at a lower energy. So here, the higher energy of the electron made the wavelength of the electron small enough, that is 100 times of the size of the proton and the neutron, small enough to feel the individual scatterers inside the proton, and the exact value of the E naught prime could then be used to extract the number of the scatterers, and indeed they found that proton had 3 point-like particles inside it. So this is what Gell-Mann's model needed. The quarks actually made a second coming. So here what you had to do is that you then measured electron energies for different angles. Then you could actually measure what is the spin of the scatterers, and everything, including the funny charges that were required by Gell-Mann's model, were confirmed by this simple measurement, innocuous experiment. You take an electron, hit the proton with it, look at a scattered electron, measure its energy, and keep on measuring it at different angles, as many angles as you can. And this measurement actually revealed that the proton was made up indeed of 3 quarks, and 3 quarks which had these funny charges that Gell-Mann's model needed. Actually, this story goes even further, and same experiments, much refined versions of these experiments, could actually show that there are indeed scatterers inside the proton other than the quarks, other than the up quarks and the down quarks. And this was the first glimpse of the gluons, and that was the first clue to the Wright theory of strong interaction, which then got the Nobel Prize for Physics in 2004. But what I am trying to show you here is how just trying to look inside at proton with higher and higher energies, along with the knowledge of the dynamics that is at action inside the proton, actually helped us understand the existence of further more structure inside a proton. This is just to tell you the large number of measurements that have been made since those decades. And this is a plot that I have taken from 1992, where they are measuring this various quantities whose behavior with this famous Q square that I told you can be computed based on this theory, which people got in 2004. And the whole thing keeps on going further and further. Not only that, but this knowledge actually can be used to make predictions what would happen at the Large Hadron Collider. And this is really what has been happening. You increase the energy further, the number of constituents inside the proton went on increasing, but that just meant that more and more quarks and gluons were created inside. And when one tries to probe it with higher and higher energy, and this increasing energy does not reveal any new constituents, but reveals only the number of quarks and gluons keeps on increasing. And at present, we have done the experiments with highest energy of the electron, which is 100 billion electron volts. That means 100,000 million quark up to the thousandth of the Fermi. So now, do we then say that the quark is not made up of anything further? Yes, we think so. Is it because we only don't have high enough energies and that's why we are saying that this is the last layer? Actually not. This is where the dynamics, our understanding how interactions happen, comes into full play with full strength. Scattering the constituents is only one way in which we hunt for what is at the heart of the matter. At present, every single piece of experimental observation agrees with the prediction of the standard model, better to 1 part in 100 millions at times. And these calculations are done by assuming that the theory, that the quarks and leptons tell you now is that now the next level of experimentation to understand the mathematics of all this or study it further is the Large Hadron Collider. And now it has found the Higgs boson. So then you say, is that also the end of the road? And again, one says that no, the answer is not. We are not at the end of the road. And we don't say simply because we want to stay in business, but we still don't understand many theoretical questions. We don't understand why does the standard model work as good as it works? We don't understand why neutrinos have non-zero mass. And some of the ideas even play with the fact that the top and the Higgs are perhaps not fundamental. But then such a scale energy at which this compositeness can be seen is maybe 100,000 giga-electron volts. Now, we are not going to be able to produce those energies. So then we need to be very smart to see whether we can use the Large Hadron Collider to test many of these ideas. And that is where this Large Hadron Collider has been built, and it's still going on, and it will go on for another 20 years at least. And just to tell you, 1 tera electron volts or 1,000 giga electron volts or 1,000 million electron volts is nothing but the energy of a flying mosquito. If I convert into ergs, it's only 1.6 ergs. The only problem is that in the Large Hadron Collider, all this energy has been squeezed in a region that is million times smaller than the mosquito. That gives us the sort of the scale at which the experimentation is happening. And we right now have a first principle understanding of many chemical, physical, and biological phenomena in terms of this correctly accepted fundamental constituents of matter that I wrote on the first few slides. And chemistry, we say, is the physics of the last electron. Chemistry of life is nothing but DNA and RNA. Formation of patterns in animal kingdom are understood in terms of basic properties of cellular material. So, life is going on at that level, we understand. But not only that, the laws of particle physics, which we have found to be functioning at distant scales of Fermis and smaller, seem to be of relevance in addressing things that happen on cosmological time scales, that is at the beginning of the universe, and astronomical distance scales, that is millions of megaparsecs and above. How was everything formed? How did in the beginning of the world, universe, how did the nucleons form? That's how we were formed. Can we explain the relative abundance of different elements in the universe? How did the stars get formed? Why do the galaxies have the shapes they have? And many of these questions can be understood in terms of nuclear physics, in terms of astrophysics, but also in terms of the known physics of the standard model of particle physics. That's essential in reaching understanding of all these very fundamental issues. And possibilities of understanding as yet ununderstood mysteries in terms of laws of physics still exist. One is, what are the chemical properties of the life on Earth and what they are? How was matter created? How was life created? Why does the universe contain only matter? Why are L-amino acids are more common in biological systems? Does it have anything to do with the left-right asymmetry that I've been talking about in the basic laws of particle physics in the standard model? So there are lots of questions that still need to be answered. There are lots of puzzles that particle physicists still want to address. There are neutrino experiments and the next generation accelerators which are being planned. Theorists like me are trying to build models for physics beyond the standard model and check how they can be tested at these accelerator experiments, and as well as the neutrino experiments. As I already told you, particle theories can provide answers to cosmological questions, dark matter, baryon asymmetry, dark energy. So the high precision cosmological measurement can constrain particle theories. Searches at the colliders can prove or disprove a particular particle physics explanation of the three cosmological puzzles that I have written here. So there are simultaneous probes into the heart of the matter and the origin of everything. So the journey on this path of curiosity, what lies within, keeps onwards. And we indeed have exciting times ahead. And I would like to flash here one of the interesting experiment that is being planned in India, our Indian mega experiment called Indian Neutrino Observatory. I hope it will come through soon. So as far as the theorists like me is concerned, the last 60 years has been that the laws of particle physics can be written and accommodated on the back of a t-shirt. This is a t-shirt you can buy in the shop at CERN. And the future is to see are there any additional corrections to these equations, and that is going to come by studying at the collider, at the LHC, properties of the known heavy particles like the top quark or the Higgs boson. And some of us who work on gravity are asking questions whether this equation needs further modifications and whether there is it is the same terms here, whether it has some other additional terms. And this is where the journey is going on. Thank you very much for your patience.